excited. I might mention this in a little bit here, but I think it was 2023, September of 2023, when we first started talking about, or at least had a webinar on this with you, Eric. So
yeah. We had and it was a big crowd too, because there was a ton of interest. That's right.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have a big crowd again today. There's a lot of interest here too. So those of you tuning in, I'd love to hear what your favorite webinar has been and favorite webinar topic has been. And maybe I should back up. Is this anybody's first time at a Greenlight Guru event? So maybe you can just throw that in the chat if this is your first time. All right, Uvi, great. Glad to have you all. Great. Hopefully it's not the last time. We love seeing new faces, but we always love seeing those who've been here many times as well. We had a couple times ago, someone said they'd been to over 40, which I'm impressed that you're keeping track.
Oh my gosh. How do you get work done?
We'll just assume it's spread over 15 years.
That's right. I want to get paid for attending webinars. That's what I want.
Exactly. All right. I think we're a minute over, so it looks like we probably have a quorum coming in from. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Today's webinar is Countdown to QMSR. What you need to know to be ready for February 2026. My name is Etienne Nichols. I am the head of global. Let's move my screens around here a little bit. I've got a little bit of technical thing going on myself today. But I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's webinar is going to run for about 60 minutes in total, and we definitely want to hear from you. So on the right side of your screen where you're already looking at that chat, looks like we already have a lot of people chatting there. Use that chat tab to engage with other attendees, to give some of your commentary, but remember to play nice. That's always be respectful. We're here to learn together. So the other section, the Q&A tab, what I recommend there is if you have any questions that you definitely want us to ask Eric at the end during the Q&A session, use that Q&A tab to input your questions so that we can keep track of those. I'll also say, even if you don't always have a question, because sometimes I attend these, I don't have a question myself, but I see someone else's question, and you can upvote those questions. So go ahead and navigate to that Q&A at some point during the presentation. And if you see a question that's relevant to you, go ahead and upvote that so that we can make sure we're asking the most relevant questions from the audience. Also, we will be sharing the full recording and the slides with all registrants after the webinar, so keep an eye out for that email from us. Very quickly, I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, which is likely a shared mission of many of you joining us today. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free webinars, partnering with world-class medical device experts like today's presenter, Eric Henry, or through our award-winning cloud-based software solutions. Greenlight Guru and Greenlight Guru, our QMS solutions, Ultralight, and our original product. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward. That means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and keeping there over time. We know the challenges that medical device companies face in this heavily regulated industry. Our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Greenlight Guru's MedTech Suite provides quality management, product development, clinical data management solutions, along with highly trained and education designed exclusively for medical device. So if you're interested in seeing why over 1,000 of the world's leading medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru, head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation for your personalized demo. All right, now to give you a proper introduction to your presenter, Eric Henry is a 35-year veteran of the high-tech and medical device industries and has led global quality and technical organizations at firms such as the NASDAQ, the Hologic, Boston Scientific, GE Healthcare, Medtronic, and Philips. After leaving the industry in 2018, Eric's work at the law firms King & Spalding and Brook & Associates have focused on advising medical device company boards, management, staff on medical device regulatory compliance, quality management systems, and strategic risk management with a specific emphasis on software-enabled devices and digital health. Eric's an adjunct faculty member at Pathway for Patient Health, a member of the AFDO RAPS MedCon's strategic committee and advises the Coalition for Health AI on the intersection of healthcare delivery and medical device manufacturing. I'll give him a chance to correct anything I may have misspoke on, but for me personally, he's kind of the canary in the coal mine. He's typically one of the first in my LinkedIn feed to post about any breaking updates, which is something I love. So if you don't follow him on LinkedIn, I highly recommend going over there and going ahead and following him at some point in the day, because he's very always up to date with his information. With that, I'll let you take it away. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks. And I feel these days I'm not as quite as up to date as the last few days as I tend to be. I'm in the middle of doing some independent consent decree audits for clients right now, and so we've been neck deep in prep, and I've missed a couple of news items, and if I always feel like I'm just like screwing something up if I can't stay right on front of things. But I appreciate the push there. And please, everyone on the call, if feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to share my thoughts on what's going on lately. So it's great to have this opportunity. As Etienne talked about before, for those of you that were a little late in coming on, we talked a couple of years ago about QMSR, the Quality Management System Regulation, which is where the FDA is aligning the medical device regulations in the US with the international standard ISO 13485. And the Green Light Guru, I think, has done a couple more with some different presenters trying to cover the same topic from different angles. And today, as Etienne and I talked about this particular presentation, the emphasis is now on being now 4 or 5 months away. How do we make sure we're not caught unprepared on February 6, 2026? So with that in mind, and I'm hoping that those slides are changing. That's fantastic. So I do have that one button figured out. We are going to talk a little bit about the changes to the to 21 CFR Part 820, which is currently the quality system regulation. I won't spend a great deal of time on that because, again, for the last year and a half, people have been talking about what's changing, how the QMSR changes it, but I do want to make sure we're all aligned on what those are very quickly. We'll talk about what a QMSR remediation program might look like, how to prepare for FDA inspections after February 2nd, 2026, how the FDA is preparing to support the quality management system regulation, and then we'll obviously open it up for Q&A after that. So let's begin with what these changes are to the regulation. I'll say firstly that, and I don't go into the background here, but what's happening in essence is that 21 CFR Part 820, the quality system regulation in the United States, is gone as of February 2nd, 2026. That content is completely deleted and is being replaced with a new 21 CFR Part 820, no longer called the quality system regulation, now called the quality management system regulation. But here in brief are sort of the changes that you would see as you walk through that new 21 CFR Part 820 in the final rule. I will, as you're staring at this screen, I will make one further admonition, which is that with that final rule comes a significant amount of content in the preamble. So if you pull up in the Federal Register, the final rule, the QMSR final rule, what you will see is 100 pages, if you're looking at it with one column per page of content. And in only the last maybe, 6, 8, 10 pages are the 21 CFR Part 820. What's the rest of it? The rest of it's called the preamble. And there is a ton of material in there that talks about how the FDA is thinking, how they've responded to certain questions from the proposed rule, how they're supporting risk management, how they're handling some complaint issues. There's all kinds of topics in there where they're responding to why things are done a certain way, why they frame things a certain way, and how they're interpreting parts of the regulation that are now written into that new Part 820. I say this every place I can. If you haven't read the preamble, you don't understand the rule. So when you look at these final rules or any regulation or any publication in the Federal Register, don't just scroll to the bottom and look at the actual regulation. Read all the material in front of it. It takes some time, but it's always worth it because it will impact how the FDA inspects you and what their expectations are for you. So now that everybody has obviously overread this first slide, the first scoping slide is largely identical to what we have in the current Part 820. Finished devices, HCTPs are all in scope. Components are out of scope, although in the preamble, and this is again why it's important to read the preamble, the FDA is very clear that they have the statutory authority to regulate component manufacturers and have chosen not to at this time. But they say that component manufacturers should comply with relevant elements of the quality management system regulation, parts that apply to them. And that if the FDA at some future point feels that component manufacturers are slipping and that they are causing problems with the public health or with compliance, they may change their mind and begin to actively regulate component manufacturers. And so just keep that in mind. There's a discussion on how to regulate, how conflicts between the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are handled, and the implementing regulations, and then how conflicts might be happening between the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and ISO 1345. Spoiler alert, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act always wins in the US. But they use as a couple of examples the words device and labeling. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines those terms. That supersedes what's in 1345. With the 1345 definitions of medical devices and labeling. And then safety and performance is defined in 1345, and they're saying that that's equivalent to safety and effectiveness in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So they just give those examples for how those kinds of conflicts or differences might be handled in the future. There's a lot of definitional changes. And in fact, even from the proposed rule, the number of definition changes has really expanded, primarily because in the proposed rule, the only ISO standard that was adopted or incorporated by reference was ISO 1345. However, in the final rule, in large part in response to feedback and comments that people made on the proposed rule, the FDA threw out all those fresh definitions that it created and instead said, let's adopt clause 3 of ISO 9000 2015 and all those definitions, except where we may clarify otherwise in this new Part 820, all of those will apply. And that will be the new glossary for the quality management system regulation. So they added, the word batch and lot. The FDA did in the final rule because that wasn't in the in ISO 9000. But they removed from the Part 820, the proposed rule, things like customer, design validation, nonconformity, and so on. Those are now part of the ISO 9000 vocabulary. The word established is gone. And I've constantly struggled with people understanding what the word established meant in the current quality system regulation, because according to the FDA, and it's in the definition section of 820.3 now, established means to define, document, and implement. And so if you haven't implemented or executed and shown evidence of execution of a document or a process, you haven't established it yet. And a lot of people think if once I've written the procedure and I've got it approved, it's established, and that's just not true. Well, that word is now actually gone from the vocabulary, and instead define and document or document and implement from the standard are now considered to be sufficient and convey the same principles. One big change for those of us that spend a lot of time getting hung up on design history file, device master record, and device history record, and where do those overlap and where are they different, especially in the DHF DMR space, that's gone. Those ideas are now gone. Instead, the design history file is now the design and development file from 1345. Device master record is now the medical device file, which is different in its relationship to the DHF currently, in that the current DMR is inside the DHF according to the way it's defined by the FDA in the current 820.3, where it defines design outputs as being the device, its packaging, its labeling, and the device master record. So the device master record in the current regulation is a design output, making it part of the DHF, a subcomponent of it. Well, in 1345, these are now very separate documents. They don't have that sort of nested relationship that we saw before. And the device history record, of course, is now the medical device or the batch record. The word risk, the definition is pulled from 14971. And then obviously there are some FDA definitions that supersede those in 1345, like device, labeling, and manufacturer. Some of those coming from the new QMSR, some of them from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Obviously, we've now incorporated by reference these two standards, or all of one standard and parts of another. So 1345 2016 and ISO 9000 2015 Clause 3 are now incorporated by reference. There is some language in the preamble saying why the FDA has authority to do that. And what they've done by incorporating by reference is stripped out almost all the content in 820 and said, go look at these ISO standards. Part of the issue, part of the reason why this wasn't done before, and it could have been because the ISO 1345 standard that was under development at about the same time the quality system regulation was in the mid 1990s, is referenced all through the current preamble to the quality system regulation. And there was a lot of push to just say, let's use that. But there were several reasons that wasn't done, but one of the primary ones was because these standards are copyrighted and you have to pay to get them. And of course, in the 1990s, the only way to get the standard was to get a paper copy of it. And there were some rudimentary scanners you could use to make electronic copies, but really these things were exchanged in paper copy and you had to go buy it. But by federal law in the US, any legal or regulatory requirement that's documented by the federal government has to be available for free to the citizens and to those that are subject to that regulation or statute. And so that caused a quandary. I have to pay for the ISO standard, but I have to have regulatory requirements for free. And so therefore now we have this thing where it's hard to get a hold of. You can't use the ISO standard if you can't get it for free. Well, the workaround in 2026, February 2nd, is that there is on the ISO or the ANSI website, there is an incorporation by reference viewer. And it's called the Incorporated by Reference Portal, IBR. And you can go there and you can view the ISO standard. You can view 1345, you can view 9000 2015, Clause 3. Here's the problem with that. You can't copy. You obviously can't copy and paste. You can't print. You can only view. So it really limits the utility of that for the purposes of being able to sort of incorporate that content into your own quality system and pass the message around, and especially to people that may be on a floor or someplace like that and don't have easy access to a screen where they can pull up websites. So that becomes a problem. So your only real option is still purchasing it from ISO. One thing to note here too, in incorporation by reference, is that future updates to the standard, which could be as early as 2026, but I think the message we've gotten now is probably not. These are up for review every 5 years. So it may be 2031 before the next real updates are made, but any of the future updates would not necessarily result in automatic updates to the quality management system regulation. Instead, what the FDA is simply saying is that the current content of 1345 2016 is now the medical device regulation in the United States. We're not going to, and we'll talk about this later, we're not going to certify you to 1345. And if you have a 1345 certification, it doesn't really mean a lot to us. We're just saying that language is now our language. So as that language changes, the FDA will obviously review and consider that possibility of incorporating some of that new language or those edits, but it's not a foregone conclusion. So just something to keep in mind there. Obviously, in the requirements for the quality management system in 820.10, they talk about 1345, but keeping in mind that the other regulations that medical device companies typically have to comply with, like Part 803 for medical device reporting, 806 for corrections and removals, if you're subject to 821, medical device tracking, that still applies, and 830 for UDI, unique device identification. The classification scheme that's currently in the quality system regulation will remain the same, and how it applies to medical device manufacturers will still be the same. The class 1, 2, and 3, where there are some exemptions to requirements to comply, will stay in place. 1345 on its own simply says it applies to all medical devices, but you have to follow local regulations. And in the US, there are still those exemptions for some class 1 devices, especially that may not be subject to the quality management system regulation. There is some extension of the traceability requirements to implantable devices, and obviously the reiteration, same language you have in the current regulation, that if you fail to comply with the quality management system regulation, your device is adulterated. Now, oftentimes we think of adulteration as there's a fly in my soup, there's some contaminant. But according to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and reiterated in the quality system regulation, and now passed forward to the QMSR, adulteration means you're not following a regulatory requirement. So technically speaking, if the FDA substantiates that you have failed to follow any element of the quality management system regulation, they have the ability to classify your device as adulterated. In fact, that is standard language in all warning letters that the FDA issues. Device labeling and packaging controls. The FDA was very underwhelmed by how ISO 13485 treated these issues. So they've added some requirements here, some additional requirements, specifically around inspection of labels. And that now has been put explicitly into the new Part 820, where the FDA felt like it wasn't in the ISO standard. Under control of records, we have some material. This will be our final sort of preemptive slide as we get into the core content. But under control of records, they did remove from the proposed rule a requirement to obtain the signature for every document, every record, because that's not currently the requirement in the quality system regulation. And an example would be things like complaints. A complaint is a quality record, but we don't require that every complaint be reviewed, approved, and released in a document management system. So in that respect, what we're seeing is a little bit of a, we get it, we kind of overstepped in the proposed rule, the final rule is better. They've defined some content requirements for complaint records and service records very explicitly, and when those complaints should be investigated. And that's a more explicit requirement than we have in the current regulation. And then one of the things I found interesting was if you're with a company that has multiple sites, and this is, by the way, what I'm about to tell you is in large part in the preamble as well. If you have multiple sites and multiple complaint handling units, you've got to define one procedure that applies to everything, and you need to identify a single entity or group that governs all of those complaint handling units if there are multiple, and all those functions. So that's something that is a little bit new and much more explicit requirement to follow. And then finally, we've introduced this idea of corrective actions and preventive actions as separate activities completely, instead of the corrective and preventive action thing we have in 820.100 now. And we've added the word corrections to the vocabulary, to the CAPA vocabulary, to the investigations vocabulary, specifically around complaints, but it adds it to more broadly across the investigational scheme, or the concepts of investigations. Those corrections that you do to fix the problem in front of you versus corrective actions, meaning to solve the problem at the root cause level so that it never happens again, are now distinct ideas that the FDA has made sure are introduced. Now, we did spend a little bit of time on that sort of level setting of what's in the proposed, or what's in the final rule. Now let's talk about what remediation looks like. And we'll just spend a few slides, maybe about 3 slides, on what remediation plans would look like if you haven't already begun, or if you're in the middle and you're not sure if you're doing it right. Remediation plans generally follow 3 big sort of phases. First, you're going to look at what you're doing now and how it might differ from where you want to be or what you need to be doing. And then once you identify where those gaps are, you fix them, you close those gaps, you do remediation work. And then finally, you come back and say, did that remediation work? Is my system now in compliance with what I intended to be compliant with the desired or future state? And you do that through a variety of ways. So gap analysis, for the purposes of what we're talking about here, which is the QMSR program, you're going to evaluate your current quality system versus the new Part 820. And if you're a combination drug device product part 4 as well, because that also changed. A lot of people don't kind of wrap their heads around that, but part 4 also changed. All those references to 820 had to be changed to 13485 clauses. So you'll have to do that gap assessment versus the standard versus the new part 820 and your quality system. And then once you identify what those gaps are, prioritize them. It may be that there's so many, you can't get them all done in time. So you're going to make those that have the most impact, that are the highest risk. You're going to do those first. So if by some horrible chance you can't get done by February 2nd, 2026, at least the things that are the most egregious, that are the most risky, will have been addressed and solved. Now, once you've got that sort of prioritized, that gap analysis done, now you go and fix them. You can do that either through a CAPA or a quality plan. I don't like quality plans to do things like this, primarily because they end up being sort of a circumvention of the CAPA system. They tend to not have the same steps and the same rigor. And frankly, I think it just makes more sense to use the quality system to fix the quality system. But it's up to you whether you do it through a CAPA or a quality plan. You create this program around how you're going to close these gaps, and then you begin to execute using good program management processes, good metrics and measurements, and know how you're burning down that task list, and holding people accountable to meeting the deadlines you've established, and to doing it in a way that addresses the gaps effectively. And then finally, you're going to verify or make sure that the remediation work you did actually did close those gaps, and that you are now in compliance with the new QMSR. And you do that in a couple of ways. First of all, you have internal audits, and then secondly, you might have some third party or external group come in and do a gap assessment. Now, I work for a law firm, and oftentimes we will recommend, because when you work that these kinds of gap assessments, if you're just trying to figure out where do I stand, and you don't want it to be a quality record that's an internal audit, where do I stand here? And do I have big issues I have to resolve? I want to know that before I start doing internal audits, given that this is the first look I've had at my quality system. So we'll often recommend people do that not as an audit, but as a gap assessment. And they'll do that under maybe attorney-client privilege, because then all those issues that are found are sort of protected and from other people looking at them, in a lawsuit, or even in an inspection, looking at that report, unless you choose to lift that privilege and to share it and to make it a broader program. But do some kind of a gap assessment initially. I would say even before you execute a formal internal audit program against it, just to get a sense of how well things worked, and then begin to continue to evaluate and monitor how compliant you are with your internal audit program ongoing. And then obviously where you see gaps, use CAPAs or some other investigational mechanism in a nonconformance record to record those gaps, and to further refine your remediation and come into compliance with the QMSR. There are some key considerations here, and of course I need to put my glasses on now because my screen is kind of small. There are things to think about when you're thinking about remediation. First of all, make sure you address the terminology changes. We talked about DHF, DMR, and DHR going away. We talked about the ISO 9000 Clause 3, 2015 Clause 3. Get that stuck into your vocabulary, into your glossary for your company. If you want to continue to use some of your terms, heck, even if you want to keep using DHF, DMR, and DHR, fine. There is no requirement for you to use those terms in your quality system. You just need to make sure that when you use a term that's different from what the FDA will have in their glossary, that you can communicate to them quickly and easily how those map, how your term correlates to some term in the other glossary. Realize that until the 2nd of February 2026, you will likely be maintaining 2 quality systems as you slow one down and ramp the other one up. Also, if you have submissions that are crossing the date barrier, so if you're in the middle of trying to respond to a deficiency letter, or if you have a PMA where the review, you've submitted it before that date, but you're not expecting feedback till after, how do you deal with that? has some conversations with the agency for how they're going to handle that. In a PMA submission in particular, you have to submit your quality system along with the submission. And so what quality system are they going to be looking at? Are they going to be looking at the QSR or the QMSR? Get that information from them. They've not yet clearly communicated how they're going to handle that yet. So we're still sort of waiting on that, and that may be handled on a one-off or one-by-one basis. But keep it in mind as a potential issue. Keep in mind that management review, internal audits, and supplier audits now have a different level of exposure during inspections than they did. So you need to prepare management reviews, internal audits, and supplier audits to be reviewed during inspections. Currently, in the quality system regulation, and as a footnote in the current quality system inspection technique document, the FDA says we won't look at those things. But in the proposed rule and in the final rule, the FDA has made it clear, well, not in the proposed rule so much, but in the final rule, they made it very, very clear, again, in the preamble, that they are lifting that restriction. They will now review all three of those types of records. And so you should prepare in your remediation program those records to be reviewed during an FDA inspection. Now, if you're already 13485 certified, it's no big deal because your notified bodies already look at that anyway. But this is something to be prepared for. Risk management. This is one of the key reasons why the QMSR exists, why 13485 was adopted. And we're going to talk more about that later, but it's one of the key considerations. Make sure that in your investigational processes, whether they be a thing called CAPA or a nonconformance or a complaint investigation or a CAPA investigation, I said CAPA already, or a design defect investigation, anything like that, that you are incorporating the idea of corrections and corrective actions as distinct things. They have always been that way in practice, in our understanding of CAPA as an industry. It's not explicitly talked about in 1345. It's not explicitly talked about in the current QSR, but in all the practices that we talk about when we train people about CAPAs, we talk about containments, corrections, corrective actions, and preventive actions. Those are now codified in the regulatory requirements. So just keep that in mind. Accessing the standards, make sure people know how to get to them. Purchase copies, purchase enough copies, purchase site licenses, whatever you have to do to be able to allow everyone that needs access to the standard to have it. Now, obviously, if they're just focused on following your procedures, then all they need access to are your procedures. But for those that are writing procedures or doing other regulatory intelligence work or doing submissions, they need to understand that your quality system is or will be compliant to those standards. And so they'll need access to those. So make sure you have that lined up and addressed throughout your system. You will, as you're making all these changes to your quality system, have a lot of internal and external references that are going to be now broken. And when I do a major document or process change, I have an impact analysis document that I always have used in my time in industry and now recommend our clients use these. That has an inbound and an outbound references section. And so what it's looking at is all the places that reference my procedure that's about to change. That's the inbound references. And the outbound references will be looking at all of the references I'm making inside my procedure to something else. I look at all those connection points and look at what needs to be changed or modified. So a change to a single procedure might cause actual revisions to many procedures and other documents outside of that one procedure before you really can call the job done. So keep that in mind. Also, look at the investigation criteria for complaints. That has now changed in the new quality management system regulation. So the QMSR gives you some specific criteria around when those investigations need to happen instead of just saying you need to decide when that's going to happen. So definitely look at make sure that you're now investigating complaints using that criteria and not just sort of deciding internally using old criteria that may now be no longer valid. And finally, labeling inspections. The FDA did mention very clearly that that the labeling, the way labeling was handled in the standard is not sufficient, and they want inspections done. And what they're calling for is inspections of a statistical subsample of labels. In particular, if you're using some label generating tool or device or system that you take a statistical subsample of all those things, all the labels that thing is spitting out, and make sure that they're still correct. But that new inspection scheme is new to the QMSR, and make sure that as you're remediating, you don't leave that out of your thinking. Now let's talk about risk management for just a second before we talk about inspections in particular. This one I found kind of tricky, and I'm not real happy about it. But the FDA kind of backstroked a little in the preamble. They do not incorporate by reference ISO 14971-2019, which is the risk management standard for medical devices, and it is recognized by the FDA. It has been used even before it was recognized by the FDA as sort of the de facto standard by which the FDA evaluates how risk happens in companies and how they should behave and how they should do that, perform that activity. But they don't incorporate it. They don't require it. Now, 13485 uses the 14971 definition of risk and has that standard referenced in a footnote. But again, 1345 doesn't even require compliance with that standard. It just sort of implicates that it's part of the discussion when they're talking about risk management in that standard. But keep in mind that when you talk about, and I attended right after the proposed rule was put out, there was a committee, an advisory committee that met for a full day meeting, and I did sit through all of that, and it was actually more interesting than I thought it was going to be. But there was a lot of discussion around why this change, why was this being done? The FDA has even talked about this in the preamble, I think, to the proposed rule, especially, and also in discussions that we've had with them. Risk management was a big driver. 1345 requires risk management. It requires it throughout the life cycle. It does make reference to the international standard, where in the current quality system regulation, risk management was not treated very well, not very thoroughly. It only appears one time in the entire current QSR, and that is in 820.30G, which is design validation, where it just simply says you need to do risk analysis where it's appropriate. So that's a little watered down, a little vague, ambiguous, not very clear on the full life cycle implications of risk management and how it should be handled. And yet, when the FDA inspects a facility and they're going to look at risk management, they always start not with design validation. They start with looking at post-market complaint data. And they will start with complaint data and recalls and field actions and those kinds of things. Look at how a risk is assessed there. And then from there, link back to the pre-market risk analysis that you did and likely finalized as part of design validation, and follow it all the way through the identification of the risk, the calculation of probability and severity, the risk controls, the verification of those risk controls, and all that traceability that happens to make sure that that risk is being addressed correctly. So they were doing that anyway, but never articulated. So what the FDA said in the preamble to the final rule, and it's super important you read this again, is that we recognize, and if you go to the FDA's recognized consensus standard database, they have 14971 in there as a recognized standard, which means that it is not required, but that the 14971 standard is, if you comply with it, you are meeting the FDA's expectations for how you should conduct your regulatory your risk management activities. So that being said, we've got key driver was risk management. It's implicated in 13485, and the preamble says you don't have to follow it, but if you do follow it, that's a really good way to do risk management the way we want you to do risk management. It says it almost just like that in the preamble. So therefore, I said all of that to say this. Incorporate 14971, if you're not already following it, into your quality management system regulation remediation program and put it into your quality system. You might as well do it. Do it now. You will have a lot of explaining to do if you're going to use any other risk management process other than 14971 to handle that element of your quality system. So that was my little sermon on risk management. But again, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I don't have to follow 14971 because they redid the whole regulation and it's not called out. No, but look at the preamble, look at the drivers for why the whole thing was done to begin with, and look at how 1345 does have tenuous links to it. Go ahead and do it. So how are we going to prepare for inspections? So I've got sort of 6 things to think about as you're thinking about inspections. First of all, nothing in the quality management system regulation changes FDA's authority to inspect sites, inspect facilities. Secondly, there will no longer be a quality system inspection technique. The QSIT document, the guide that we all look for to see what's the FDA looking at. And they had the 5 big areas, and they would pick 3 and to view, and they would get to other parts of the quality system through those. That's all gone. That's gone. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's going to replace it here in a second. Note, and this is a key thing, it came up in the advisory committee meeting, it's come up in the preambles. FDA inspections will not give you an ISO certificate. They are not a standard, they are not a notified body. All they're doing is saying that language is now our language. They are not saying that that they will certify you to 1345. And if you do have a 1345 certificate, this does not exempt you from FDA inspections. You will still get inspected by them. Also, except if you go to the next box, if you're under medical device single audit program, you will be exempted and will continue to be exempted from routine FDA inspections. But the impact of the quality management system regulation on the language in MDSAP is not yet been fully assessed. For those of you that are familiar with MDSAP, it's a program that allows you, and there's several countries that are part of this program. I think 5 core countries, and then there's some others that also have some sort of recognition, but they don't have say in how MDSAP looks. But the MDSAP program allows you to get an audit by an auditing organization in one country, and a bunch of other countries will then recognize the report, that the results of that audit for their own purposes. Now, currently, it's the US, Brazil, Canada, Japan, Australia. I think that's all of them that are the sort of the core group, and there's others as well. And each country recognizes these audits in different ways. In the US, what they say is a routine inspection from an auditing organization under MDSAP from any of these other countries will not happen from the FDA. We will not come and do a routine inspection. They will be preempted by an MDSAP audit. However, for-cause inspections, pre-market inspections would still be applicable, and you would still get those from FDA even if you're under MDSAP. So my recommendation in this program, by the way, is if you're working in any of these other countries and you're not part of the MDSAP program, consider becoming a part of the MDSAP program. It has some significant benefits. And then finally, as we said before, management review, internal audits, and supplier audits are no longer exempt from inspection review. The FDA's made it clear they're lifting that restriction. They will be reviewing these. So you need to talk internally about how you're going to deal with that. And specifically in regard to things like management review, you need to talk with legal counsel. I would encourage you within your organizations and see how they might want to handle that as well. Given the fact that in management review and in internal audits for that matter, you want to be able to be open and honest with yourself. What are my problems? What are my issues? And based on what I identify, let's go fix them. And so you want to be very transparent internally about what your issues are so that you can go fix them. But then again, if those are subject to inspection, does that expose you to risk? And that's a very tricky balance to strike. And so your management team should really get together and fully assess what the impact of that and the implications of that new level of exposure are, and how you're going to deal with that. And I have suggestions that we can talk about offline if you're interested. My animation didn't work on this because Etienne, the way that the tool they're using to do this seminar doesn't, for some reason, and I'm on a MacBook, the whole thing with PowerPoint didn't work. I couldn't share the screen. So it's not near as funny as I thought it would have been had you this one at a time. But the message behind this slide is to get ready for an inspection, practice. Do practice audits, gap assessments on a regular basis. Start off with a gap assessment. Make sure that you're, close those gaps, do internal audits, do other gap assessments. Maybe don't do them for the whole quality system, but focus on particular areas. So I would just encourage you to, as often as you can, give yourself those checks and those outside perspectives on the work that you've done, and begin to hone how you handle front room and back room and the whole audit management process against those requirements, and how you explain yourself if somebody has questions. That kind of practice, that kind of exercises, and there's lots of companies like mine and others that can help you do that, and even help you manage through the FDA inspection when it comes, to be able to handle that effectively. So just keep practicing. And then the final little topic we'll have before we go into a little bit of Q&A is how the FDA is actually preparing internally. So as I said in the previous slide, QSIT's going away. The Quality System Inspection Technique document completely going away. They are not replacing it. They are not revising it. They're disappearing it. What's going to happen instead is the compliance guide, which has been around for a long time, is going to have significant changes to Chapter 1, Subchapter 130, which is on inspections, and Chapter 3, which is the part of the compliance guide about devices. Because keep in mind, this compliance guide is for all the FDA. So it handles food, drugs, cosmetics, veterinary products, tobacco, and devices, everything they regulate. Chapter 3 is devices. Chapter 1, Subchapter 130 is about inspections. Those two chapters are going to get significant revision. My understanding from someone who knows and someone who actually, I think, made some of these changes is that those changes have already been made. However, they will not release them early. You will see those changes on February 2nd, 2026, from the information I've had. I don't know how, if it's hours earlier than that or a few days early or a week or two. My impression, though, is no one outside those who need to know within the FDA will see these revisions to the compliance guide prior to the 2nd of February, 2026. There's also some training going on with OMDRO, the Office of Medical Device and Radiological Health Operations. We don't know exactly how QMSR will be impacted, or if there will be an impact based on the reorg that happened not too long ago, where ORA, the Office of Regulatory Affairs, was changed to the Office of Investigations and Inspections. Inspections and Investigations, I can't remember which I goes first. But basically what happened in that reorg is some people in ORA, especially those that are handling things like consent decrees and some of the lab work and stuff, all that was sent back to the center. And the district offices and the regional offices are now just handling inspections. So they're really primarily focused on inspections and investigational activity. Second to the last bullet here is an interesting one, because the FDA is making changes to the regulatory requirements for the whole United States by essentially throwing out what was there and putting in something new, even though they're saying it was substantially equivalent to begin with. If you've ever been part of a large remediation program, or even a small one where you just changed a procedure, but you've made significant changes to it, you know that even if you think it's perfect, once people start using it, you find out it's not as perfect as you thought it was. And so there will be unanticipated consequences of the work you've done that you're going to go back and make some fixes and change things. And, oh, I didn't think about that, and put that in there. And, oh, that connection doesn't work the way I thought it did. All kinds of things are going to happen. This won't be any different. I fully expect there to be, at some point, some parts of the quality management system regulation, once executed and people inspect against them, where there will be conflicts with the current statutory authority given to the FDA under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and we're not really sure how that's all going to play out. So I think they're prepared for that. We need to be prepared for that as well. Have your legal counsel and other folks in your company, if you see things in there that look a little off in terms of how this, is this new, the QMSR changes your relationship to the FDA, ask, is that right? Does that make sense? And then, have some discussions. And then finally, we don't know about when MDSAP's going to change. They are drafting updates. Those things are being talked about and considered, but we don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to change or exactly how that's going to work. But the FDA is preparing to make those changes so that the MDSAP program stays current. And what I didn't mention in my previous discussion with MDSAP is the reason changes need to be made is for each of the 5 core countries that I mentioned, you have the MDSAP audit approach document, which is if you want to look at how MDSAP audits go, that's the document you go to. And they have the 1345 requirements and other requirements in there. And underneath each of those sections, if a particular country has a specific requirement that's exclusive to that country that goes above and beyond or is different than what's in the MDSAP document, that will be stated under that section in the MDSAP audit approach. So the US has lots of entries in there where it makes sure that the quality system regulation is fully complied with if you're going to have an MDSAP cert that includes the US in scope. So in addition to MDSAP core requirements, you have these additional US ones. Well, now all those are going to change. A lot of them will frankly go away, but there will be some changes and those are still being drafted and we're not really sure when that's going to happen. So that being said, I am done. Mr. Nichols, I'll call you back to the screen. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to entertain those.
All right, lots of questions. So we'll try to punch through some of these relatively quickly. Really appreciate it. First of all, though, Eric, really, this is awesome. And apologies for the technical inability to show the graphic. I actually went and watched it, and it's pretty funny. So hopefully if people have questions, we can send that slide to them. Jan asked the question, if the company is currently compliant to 21 CFR, Part 820, and ISO 1345-26, what do they need to do? I know you kind of answered this a little bit. I don't know if you want to touch on this one more time.
Yeah, I think the one good message from that question or the implication from that question is if you're already certified to 1345, the remediation work that you do will be minimum to moderate, as opposed to you're not following 1345, you're a small company, only have US market, and you're only focused on US regulations. Your remediation program is going to be a lot more hefty. It's going to be a lot more involved, more resource intensive, more expensive, longer to play out. So what do you need to do? My recommendation is go to the new Part 820, the QMSR Part 820, look at the places, still do the gap assessment, but your primary gap assessment now will not be against 1345. It'll be against those very specific set of things inside Part 820 that are different. There's some definitions that the FDA is calling out. There's this, when should you conduct complaints, label inspection, those things that are different. The FDA calls out. That's really all you're gap assessing against. As part of 1345, you should be complying with ISO 9000:2015 Clause 3 anyway, because 1345 calls it out in definition section as the place where the rest of the definitions exist. So this should minimize the gap assessment that you have to do, but that should be pretty much it.
Okay. I thought this was a good question. This one's from Ali, if I'm saying your name correctly. Is there any issue if we continue using the terms DHF, DMR, and DHR?
Probably not. I don't know. I think the short answer is going to be no. And even the FDA investigators, I'll almost guarantee you it'll probably be, people will have to die off or retire at the FDA before that term never gets mentioned. They're just going to automatically be using it because they've used it for so many years. My recommendation here is continue to use those if it's embedded in your culture. Don't upend your entire culture for this. There is one or two additional requirements in the medical device file in 1345 beyond what the FDA currently requires in the DMR. So make sure you've got that locked in. But if you're still using these terms, and even if you're still considering the DMR part of the DHF, fine. But as you should in your gap assessment, any place you have definitions that are different in your quality system from what 1345 and ISO 9000 Clause 3 have, note how they map. Create a map. This term in our vocabulary means this in 1345 and 9000. So if you create that sort of map, and then as you practice inspections, do some of that, right? The FDA is like, what's a DHF? That's not in our terminology. If you get a brand new FDA investigator and he starts, his first day on the job is February 2nd, 2026, and he walks into your building and he's like, what's a DHF? We don't have those. Well, how do you explain that? And you just need to have a map that says, well, that means design and development file. Oh, okay, I get it. Let's move on, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Steve asks the question, what happened to MDSAP? Why isn't there a push for it? I don't know if you want to I'm not exactly sure. There was a lot of thumbs up for this one, so I don't know if you have any
Yeah,
thoughts on
well,
that.
MDSAP is still there.
Yeah.
MDSAP is still very much a very. It's still a program supported by the FDA. The FDA is still a core. The U.S. is still a core member of the MDSAP group of five. It's not going away at all, and the FDA will continue to recognize MDSAP audits in lieu of FDA routine inspections. The only delays that are happening right now, and I'm not sure how big the delay will be, is to modify the U.S. specific language in the audit approach document to now comply with the QMSR, where it currently complies with the QSR. But MDSAP still very, very powerful, very big thing. And in fact, I encourage any company that can, get into MDSAP, use that program. Oftentimes it's a lot. The relationships between companies and auditing organizations or notified bodies is often a lot less confrontational than it can be with an FDA investigator under certain circumstances. And just the inspection or the audit experiences themselves can be much less tense under MDSAP than they might be under an FDA inspection. So if you can get into that program, do it.
Yeah. Okay. Great answer there. There's another question just in the chat that I'll just throw it out. One person said, I think it was Kenneth who said this presentation should have happened in January. And we've kind of been doing these over the years. I know I mentioned first one was in 2023. We did one in October 2024, but I think embedded in there is kind of an assumption or a question, depending on how you look at it. How long will this take? And I don't know if you touched on that or not. If you did, I missed it. Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be a consultant now and say it depends.
Yeah.
Um,
Perfect.
Again, if you're already 1345 certified and you're also doing business in the U.S., then I don't know, and you're a fairly small to medium sized organization, a couple of months, right? I don't know. I'm just kind of guessing. If you're a
Right.
really large organization, but you're focusing just in the US, which would be probably not the case very much, and you don't really think about 1345 and now you have to, well, this is going to be a big deal. It could take a long time.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, initially in the proposed rule, the FDA only offered 1 year of transition time. Industry asked for anywhere between 2 and 4. This came up in that advisory committee meeting in March after the proposed rule came out. They settled on 2. So we've had time, but at the same time, if for some reason the light's just dawning, and that sometimes happens, we know with EU MDR, my
Oh yeah.
gosh, that thing still isn't completely off the ground. And it was affected. It was published in 2017. So we're not going to be that bad. The FDA is going to be like, it's February 2nd, off you go. If you're not ready, then you'll get some 43 observations.
Right.
But yeah, if you haven't started now, get going. I mean, you don't have a day to waste.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask one more question. Let's see here. This because I know we're almost out of time. Where did it go? There was a specific one I wanted to ask. This one from Adrian. Can FDA inspect management reviews that occurred prior to February 2nd, 2026?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to give you an educated guess answer because nobody at the FDA is sharing this. This would be part of the sort of the transition guidelines they would put in the compliance guide, right? Because they are snapping the line on February 2nd. I would say no. My guess would be that you were creating management reviews under the quality system regulation where this was exempt. Under the quality management system regulation, they are no longer exempt. So management reviews that occurred after February 2nd would be what they reviewed. But keep in mind that they've always had the statutory authority to do it. On February 2nd, they now are exercising that statutory authority to review those documents. They could go back and review them all as far back as they want. There's nothing saying they can't. How forgiving and understanding the FDA will be on recognizing, documents after that period, or after that February 2nd date, having a different sort of process than the ones before, it's really up to them. And I'm kind of as eager as you are to see, not just with management reviews, but with other documents that may look differently after than before.
Yeah. Okay, I know we have lots of more questions, and Eric, you're a wealth of knowledge, and I wish we could go through all these. We'll go ahead and provide these to you. I don't know if you'll be able to answer or not, and that's totally up to you. We'll look at these internally and see if there's some way we can maybe come up with a way to do an FAQ or answer of some sort. But
Yep.
those of you,
And
if you
by
have
the
more
way,
questions,
again,
go ahead.
people can feel free to send through LinkedIn as well. You could message me on LinkedIn, and I'll answer them there as well.
Okay. Yeah, I would definitely take advantage of that if I were in the audience right now. So, but I know we're also at time, so I really want to just respect that and thank you so much for all of your knowledge, sharing this, all of the presentation. Those who've been listening, thank you so much for spending some time with us and answering all these or asking all these questions. That's always very helpful. I'm going to launch a survey. The two things. I put a ticker on there. If you want to see how Greenlight Guru's new software Ultralight can help you get ready, feel free to check that out and put some time on some calendars to see that software if you're interested. Also, I'm going to launch a survey real quickly so that if you want to let us know what you thought of this presentation, what you'd like to see in the future, that's helpful for us so that we can always be presenting relevant information and continue to stay on top of these things. Last thing I'll say, because we always get this question, slides and webinar, they will be available following the presentation. Keep an eye out for that email. But all right, I'll let you all get back to the rest of your day. Eric, thanks again. I'll let you get back
My
to it.
pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Bye.